I mean, we all understand that, like, having slaves wasn't your idea, but it's 2020. At least pretend you're embarrassed.
I'm Rebecca LAVOIE, and this is Crime Writers On, the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, TV, other podcasts. And this week, was the lynching of a wealthy black man more than just an act of hatred? Was Isadore Banks killed so white people could steal his land and his money? Two reporters try to solve the 1954 cold case in unfinished Deep South. Joining me to get that done is my real-life husband and true crime co-author, former TV journalist, and the one with all the wisecracks, the love of my life, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Also with us is journalist, true crime author, licensed private investigator, certified cat lady, former defense investigator, and the one most likely to get enraged by injustice, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura.
Hello. I have a new title coming up, Rebecca. It's going to be...
What's that?
I'm going to be a certified pet detective in another
Can't wait.
8 weeks.
Let me just get my pen.
That's a real thing?
To the script.
Oh, yeah.
One can be certified as a pet detective.
I'm actually going to be like a specialized cat detective, and I might have a cat detection.
Specializes in cats.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a need for it, Kevin.
Apparently, a big niche, a big, like, unserved community of cats with problems that need detectiving.
Is that a federal office or is it state or what's?
She's going to be Cat the Bounty Hunter.
Yeah, that's me.
Finally with us is the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy and host of the Strange Arrivals UFO podcast, our lovable negative Nelly, Toby Ball. Hello, Toby.
Hello, Rebecca.
All right, so let's just get started, shall we, and talk about this podcast? Let's get it done.
That's why we're all here.
That's why we're all here. Producers Taylor Hum and Neil Shea conduct a 2-year investigation into the 1954 lynching of Isadore Banks in Crittenden County, Arkansas. They find the killing of the prominent black businessman may not have been solely an act of racism. There may have also been a financial motivation.
In Marion, we found people who still remembered Isadore, who still wanted to know what happened to him. They told us that to find the killer, we had to follow the money. So we did. And when you follow the money, you find the sheriff.
Unfinished Deep South from Witness Docs seeks Banks' killers through reluctant interviews of aging residents and a record trail created by those preserving a white power structure. The podcast also touches on the larger issue of the thousands of lynching victims not merely murdered, but erased from history. So, Kevin, this podcast is a little different than other podcasts we've been reviewing.
Yep.
It's not sensational. It's a little bit drier, a little bit straighter. Talk about how you feel about sort of the tone and presentation of this investigation.
Well, if I have a single knock on the podcast, it's that it doesn't have a lot of sizzle, but it is the kind of podcast that we really like here where it's very in-depth. You have here a pair of embedded journalists that went to the town and were there for 2 years working on a very old cold case. And they also did an awful lot where they took a crime and they told that story, but were also able to discuss a larger issue, a larger theme, which was around racial justice and the acts of lynching. And I learned an awful lot about that practice that I didn't know, that it wasn't, in this case, I thought it was really interesting that they presented it as that it wasn't just an act of racial terrorism, but that a lot of times, the act was to erase that person completely. Right. Not just kill them, but just obliterate any record that they had been there. And then the next step is, well, then all of their, all that they had sort of up for grabs in this white power structure. So your business and your cash and your land, all of a sudden, it's ripe for the taking.
Now, this podcast is made. We hear that Neil Shea is a documentary filmmaker, and I think it does have sort of that flavor of that sort of earnest documentary approach. Toby, what did you think of the style of the podcast? It is very, very straight. It doesn't have a lot of the, kind of sexy true crime components that even some historical podcasts that we listen to have.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it took me a little while to get used to it. I was listening to it I began listening to it on a drive, but I mean, I just think their research and I mean, I guess it's a combination of historical research and then there's some journalism is so compelling, and the story is so compelling, and I think important, especially like at our present moment in time, that it really, to me, I mean, I thought the content was so compelling that the sort of dryness just wasn't really much of a factor as things went on, because I was so interested in what they had to say that the delivery didn't really bother me too much. They also do that thing where they're, switching back and forth between them, which I know we kind of criticized in The Orange Tree, which it didn't bother me as much as it did some people in that one. And here, again, it was one of those things where for the first 15, 20 minutes, I noticed it, and then it kind of melted away as I became really wrapped up in the story and what they'd uncovered and some of the history they were going through.
I actually do have just a small critique of the podcast that I'm going to take this opportunity to make, because it has to do with the narration and the switching of the narration. There is something that kind of bothered me about the fact that the hosts of this podcast pronounced Isadore's name differently than everyone in his family and everyone in his community pronounced it. Taylor pronounced it Isadore. Neil pronounced it Isadore. And then we'd hear them talking to people, and one of them would say Isadore, and the person would say Isadore. And I just felt that there was a little bit, it's a small thing, but for me, there was just a little bit of outsideriness to that. And we do hear that this couple is from Brooklyn. They're not from this place. We do hear that they, looked for a story to do like this. So they don't have an intensely personal connection to the story. And so I guess that little detail just kind of stuck out to me and kept taking me out of the story. It sounds like it was just me, but I just wanted to mention it because it's something that I hear when I listen to podcasts like this. Now, Laura, you think, I know sometimes when we listen to stories about racial justice and a lot of these historical stories that can get really deep and very, very painful, the detail of this murder was that Isadore was lynched. He was hanged from a tree. He was burned. He was a very successful man in his community. We sort of heard about his rise. And we also heard about some of the social justice he tried to bring to his community by bringing the NAACP to his town. But it is very, very painful at its core. And there's a lot of really racist white people in this story. This was a difficult listen for you or not, Laura Bricker?
It started off, I think, more difficult, because initially hearing the details right off, in the first episode about how he died and how he was lynched is horrific. But like Toby was saying, I think just the level of reporting in this, which I think this is probably one of the best examples of in-depth reporting that we've actually reviewed in quite some time. So as the story got going, it was hard to listen to. It was uncomfortable to listen to. But I think that's exactly why we should be listening to it. And I think it's so timely now. And I mean, the fact that they were working on it for 2 years and it's now released at this moment in time is really kind of uncanny if you think about what's going on across the country right now. So it was hard to listen to, but it was, and I mentioned that to someone. They said, oh, you're going to not like it then. I said, no, actually, I really like it because it's just so well done and it was so well reported and so well sourced. And I didn't notice the dryness, I think, as much as you guys did, just because I was so drawn into all of the voices that they had incorporated into the story. I mean, they had so many interesting people that they included. Didn't you guys? I just found all the different voices so interesting.
Oh, certainly. And I also found the characterizations of some of these, historical characters very interesting. One of the things that we hear about in this town is that there was this sheriff who's still sort of venerated by white people in the community, but who, when he died and then when his widow died, had millions of dollars in the bank, even though he made something like $5,000 a year. Turns out he was sheriff and tax collector and
Oh,
was
man, what a
potentially
gig.
shaking down people in this community. Kevin, what did you think of that dynamic?
I could not believe that you could hold both of those jobs. Because, well, I mean, I guess anything's possible, but yeah. But it certainly made for what could be a really interesting criminal enterprise because, they did say that even if the sheriff, was not involved in a lynching, that the sheriff would have to have known and okayed it, so to speak. So then when you also have this follow-up where the victim of the crime, maybe the sheriff is the one that financially benefits. And it's, when you die with $7 million,
Yeah.
then, it's like, oh, well, there's a lot of smoke there.
Were you at all curious as to why that storyline was dropped in the podcast? Because the podcast does move on from this theory about the sheriff being involved to other theories. Ultimately it sort of lands on, his immigrant Italian fellow farmers were angry, wanted his land. There may have been, they thought a relationship between him and another woman, which, probably wasn't true. And even if it was true, that's still racist. But it kind of moves on from that storyline of the sheriff. Were you troubled that they didn't follow up on that?
Well, I wouldn't say I was troubled. I mean, I thought that was certainly the juiciest of the plot lines. But it seems like, that just in reality, that didn't really go anywhere. They ended up finding stronger information about other avenues, including, this house painter with the bum leg who apparently confessed to the town gossip or whatever her role is at the Steamboat
She's the
Museum.
Laura Bricker of this town.
Yes.
Let's be real.
She totally is. She totally is. So there were some other good, directions to go on before they kind of come around and give us what ultimately they think happened.
Toby, there are a lot of kind of deep historical asides in this podcast. What do you think of the way that they weave history into this story?
Yeah, I thought it was generally done pretty well. I mean, I sometimes those things seem like such tangents and then it's hard to bring it back. But, I think it's hard to tell the story without having some historical context, particularly the way, talking through Reconstruction and about how, the backlash against Reconstruction and then sort of the emergence of sheriffs as being these very powerful figures in these counties and basically supporting white supremacy and enforcing it. Yeah, I thought it was good. I thought it would have been really hard to get a full sense of the dynamics that were going on in that community without understanding, 50 years of history leading up to it.
Now, Laura, do you agree that you are the town gossip, Rosalind O'Neill, that we meet in this podcast? Is that you in this town? Is that the role you would play? You'd be the person that the reporters come to. You'd have all the information, and yet you'd be like, yeah, I don't want to get sued, so I'm just going to let you guess, and I'm just going to nod if you land on the person that I think actually killed this man.
Rebecca, it's like you've been in my house today or something, because I alerted, there was a situation in my town with voting that happened yesterday, and I've had people all day reaching out, what's going on? Do you know anything? Do you know if there's photos? Do you know who it is? And I'm like, I don't know.
Should we take a moment to digress and get the story?
We can talk about it. We can talk about it in the podcast version of the show. People want to listen to that. They can check out our full podcast.
Well, I'll just say,
is that a good teaser?
Everybody needs somebody like that in their town, Rebecca, and I am glad to fill that role in my town. So thank you.
Yep. Well, one role that I'm glad you're not filling is the role of the other townswoman that we hear. They do talk to some pretty racist white people in this podcast, including one woman who, a lot of people just sort of have this longing for how it used to be, which I always find very troubling. I even find it troubling on HGTV in Unlike in like shows that take place like in Mississippi when they're like, let's just bring back the old Southern charm of this house. I'm like, can we not talk about the old South, please, with such nostalgia? But there's a lot of that in the podcast. And we do hear from the one woman who, sort of talks about that. And she's like,
almost all my relatives had slaves. But I don't mean 1,000 slaves. I'm talking about, 8, maybe 3. And they were considered family. So yes, I am a Southerner. I would fly my Confederate flag if I could.
Can't you?
No, it upsets my children, especially my daughter.
she's like, I can't even put my Confederate flag out. The pot, and Neil's like, well, can't you?
Yeah,
like,
that
if you
sucks
wanted
for
to.
you.
And she's like,
so
no,
hard.
because it upsets my kids. I'm like, good for your kids, lady. Good for them.
I mean, we all understand that, like, having slaves wasn't your idea, but it's 2020. At least pretend you're embarrassed by the
Exactly.
fact that your family owned slaves.
Yes, at least pretend that you think it was shameful and that it was wrong. Please.
Just a little
For
bit.
the microphone.
I mean, like you said, it wasn't 1,000 slaves. It might have been 8, but we treated them well.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
They were like part of
Not
the
okay.
family.
Super nice.
That part I was like,
They were like part of the
Really?
family. They were loved.
yeah.
I'm sure they were thrilled.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Toby, what is it about lynching? I mean, this crime in particular, these documentarians really, except for the black voices we hear in the podcast, they can't get anyone to talk even about the fact that this crime existed, that Isadore was murdered, that, this is something that deserves to be remembered and deserves to be uncovered. What do you think of that kind of like, we're not going to talk about ism that seems really prevalent with every white voice in this podcast?
They do a good job of sort of, again, historically setting the scene with talking about how lynchings were these, spectator events, where they'd run special trains and they'd like publish the day and time in the newspaper so people come out and watch them. But one thing I was struck with is, just how violent, this community and other communities were, that you would have, a lot of people you knew in town would be responsible for murdering people. It just seems crazy. And then you add the fact that it's racial violence. So I think there's a few things that are going on there. One of which is, again, it's hard to, acknowledge that legacy of violence, that in a small town like this, it's all the same families, and they talk about that. So it's saying, my grandfather or my father or my great-grandfather or whatever, he killed some people. He lynched some people. I think that's a tough one to kind of face up to. And I think it also undermines their sense of, again, when you talk about this like longing for the old South, it's like, what is the power structure here? And does acknowledging, they talk about lynching is like erasing that person. It's not just
Right.
killing them, it's erasing them. And so what does it mean to acknowledge them and bring them back? What effect does that have? So, I think it's complicated. And I think that's one of the reasons why in that last episode, when they talk about, and I'm not going to remember his name, but who does that lynching memorial, that's one of the reasons why it's so powerful, is because these people were not supposed to be remembered.
One of my favorite episodes of the podcast was the episode where they dissected what lynching actually is and was. And it is a word that is misused, has been co-opted in some instances by people who, talk about a digital lynching or a modern lynching. And, a lynching is a lynching. And I think the podcast does a really great job in giving historical context and talking to the right historians to really define it. And one of the aspects of lynching that really, like all these crimes have in common is the grotesque display of the victims for the public. Obviously, there were these public lynchings, but even in the case of Isadore's lynching, everyone knew where the body was for days. And like kids were riding their bikes over to look at it, and people were gawking at it. And it becomes sort of like a thing that just is there in town that's designed to terrorize other Black people and to titillate racist white people. Kevin, what did you think of that episode?
Yeah, and also to soothe the nerves of poor white people. Because as the academics pointed out, the message it sent to Black people loud and clear, but the message it sends to white people is that this will never happen to you.
Right.
So we're all in this together, white people. And, and so that's the kind of thing that people try to do in the modern age by signaling to people, to other white people that we're doing this and it's never going to happen to you, and that's why you need to be on this side, right? So it's really fascinating because part of the reason, and it's by design, that historically most of us don't know an awful lot about the acts of lynching and what's behind it, and the 4,000 victims, nameless victims, unidentified victims, at least, of lynching in the South over a several decade period.
Kevin, were you surprised to hear, this is something that we sort of get bits and pieces of in other media that we've watched, even recently, even Watchmen sort of touched on this, about all of the wealth and land that was stolen from generations of Black Americans. This is a big part of the reparations conversation, isn't just sort of, where Black people are in America because of the white supremacist power culture, but because of the actual money and land that was stolen from Black people in post-Reconstruction America.
Yeah, even I think this is that Isadore Banks' grandmother was who had been a slave.
She was a businesswoman.
Yeah. Was a very successful businesswoman, and then but all of a sudden, from one census to the next, she just sort of disappears, and it's also part of the again, when we think of lynchings, we think of it sort of it being a victim at random. A Black man, probably poor, was targeted by a bunch of guys in a pickup truck, and like that situation, right? You never think about it that in a lot of cases, people were particularly targeted for maybe hate or political reasons, but also because for the economic reason, it was so easy to do what amounts to a hostile takeover, because while Isadore Banks and others like him may be wealthy and prominent and successful business people, there was a certain social structure that would not protect them from that. So they were marks. They were easy marks because if you could disrupt their lives in a way that you couldn't with white businessmen, you could come in and reap the economic rewards of that crime.
Of course, there was the greed component. Toby, I just kept thinking, and this is one of the reasons why I was troubled by sort of the dropping of the sheriff storyline. I just kept thinking of a sheriff who also runs the tax collector's office. We kept hearing over and over again from all of these Black victims of these crimes, and about them in historical context, like they were late on their taxes, and then they would come and, they would take their land. But if you are the one recording who is paying their taxes, what's to say you're not just not recording it? You're putting the money in your pocket, the tax money. You're recording it as a non-payment, and then you have grounds to take the land. There's so many.
These rich people are $4.
Yeah, there's so many opportunities. Toby, this is really I think one of the underexplored parts of history when it comes to structural white supremacy in the United States, right?
Yeah, well, in this case, it's hard to know what kind of restraints the sheriff had about what he could get away with or not. And then you wonder too, it's like where did that money come from if he didn't actually own these pieces of land, and it seems like he was probably getting a cut of something. So, I've got my theory about how that all could have happened. But yeah, I mean, it's a situation when there's not a whole lot of recourse, right, for Black citizens. And, it sounds like the Italians would argue for them either. But that, there's no, if something happens, if the sheriff does something unjust, there's no place to go to.
Yeah.
You've got to physically hold them off, I guess. I mean, they do tell that story about Isadore and those two guys like driving up on him and him like driving them off because he was an army sniper or something.
That's right. Shooting at. That was a shootout.
So that was that's a good story.
Laura, these reporters use a lot of tools in the documentarian and reporting toolbox, but one that I haven't heard of very often is they put up a billboard in the town. Anyone know what happened to Isadore Banks style billboard?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I was like, good for them. I was like, wow, that was a length that, quite a length to go to. But what it made me think about was that they were appealing to a generation of people in that town that aren't on social media, that might not be scrolling the internet, that would drive around and see a billboard as a way to know that something was going on about this case, where they might not necessarily see other outreach efforts that, you might do through whatever, the newspaper. Well, I guess they might see the newspaper, but I felt like that was appealing to an older generation, which is the generation they want, that actually knows what happened. So, but I was like, wow, that was impressive. And then from there, right into, tracking down the daughter of the suspect, one of the suspects at that she was the little girl that was allegedly attacked by somebody. And was that Isadore's case? I'm sorry.
Yes, that was the house painter who allegedly confessed to the Laura Bricker of the town.
Yes. Okay.
He was involved in another killing where a teen
That's the one
was suspected of having, chased his stepdaughter, and that they chased him and they shot him.
That was really well. I liked the transparency in that, the transparency in the reporting, because it was like pretty interesting. They're going and they're like, and then everything went to bleep and
duty.
They turn off the microphones and you're like, this is going nowhere. And then how it all, and this isn't the first time they've tried to talk to her. I mean, this has been months and months, or maybe even longer than that. And how that all unfolds with this, getting heated with her husband on the lawn, and you're like, oh, this isn't good. And then they end up spending 6 hours in their house. And that was really interesting. I loved hearing how that played out, but also I just feel like people are sort of unburdening themselves with information that they've been holding in for so long. And, it seems like they were ready.
Well, before we get to our thumbs up or thumbs down review of Unfinished Deep South, if you want to hear an expanded discussion, plus our conversation about the very juicy HBO NXIVM documentary, The Vow, check out the Crime Writers On podcast, subscribe and download it wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can like and follow us right here on Facebook and Instagram. Tell us your review of Unfinished Deep South in the comments. And of course, you can join our amazing community in the Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group. Lots of true crime fans there. And for exclusive podcasts and more, join us at patreon.com/partners in crime media. All right, let's do what we do. Panel, I'd like for you to tell me and our listeners, should they check out Unfinished Deep South? Do you give this podcast a thumbs up or thumbs down review? Laura Bricker, I'm going to start with you.
This is a big thumbs up. So like I said earlier, this is definitely something that's hard to listen to. The details are beyond upsetting. But this is, I really feel like, one of the best reported, researched, and told stories that we've listened to in a podcast in quite some time. They spent 2 years researching this. They have sources all over the place. I didn't mention, I loved the music choice that they used when they were having sort of the old timers in town recount the history. I just thought it was really well done, and I think it was just a tremendous piece of reporting. So big thumbs up.
Toby Ball, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for Unfinished Deep South?
Yeah, I think there's just so much to think about in this one. And one of the things I thought about, and we talked about a little bit earlier, about how, these lynchings where they would leave the bodies so that people could see them and stuff. And it reminded me that, Michael Brown in Ferguson, his body was left in the street for hours. Mm-hmm. And what is the sort of historical resonance of that? So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff to think about in this. I think my other thought is that it would it's a pretty good companion piece to the second season of In the Dark. I think this kind of comes out of the same, institutionalized, systemic, racist society that Curtis Flowers was victimized by. So that's a long way of saying it's a big thumbs up. I really thought this was great. Highly recommend it. Again, if you start listening to it, you're like, oh, it's a little bit dry. Just, give it 15, 20 minutes. I just think the whole thing was really compelling.
Kevin Flynn.
Yeah, I'm going thumbs up on this one as well. There are some pieces that are written for a time, and there are some that the times come and reach them. And it's sort of like they had been preparing this, unaware that we would have this moment of racial reckoning in our country. So it is of a perfect moment to come out with this. It's all the things that we like about podcasts and that we have given praise to before. Thorough, in-depth, long-form, highly committed, high production value. Again, not a lot of sizzle, but an awful lot of substance. And I certainly like it when they look at a larger societal goal. When they start off by saying, we're going to try to solve a 65-year-old cold case, that's a pretty high bar, and I'm always worried. And, to stay in the spoiler-free zone here, I'll say I think that they gave us an acceptable answer for what may have happened, and I'm okay with that. And lastly, I learned that, lynchings are not about keeping score or settling scores. It's about wiping the scoreboard clean and just an effort to get rid of a person and everything that they ever stood for and everything that they ever had. And that's a powerful message for people to learn if they haven't already.
I agree with the last part of what you just said, and that is the main reason why I'm giving this podcast a thumbs up. It is very thorough, very interesting. I learned a lot. The writing and storytelling overall is very strong. I do have some qualms with the production and the way it's put together. I do feel, as I said in the discussion part of it, a little bit of detachment between the documentarians and their subjects, not just the mispronunciation of Isadore's name, but also the sense of, being outsiders coming in. I'm not sure they ever cross that Rubicon where they ever feel like insiders in the story to me as a listener. And that is important. That is what differentiates to me, the In the Dark team, also, predominantly white storytelling team going to the South to tell a story about predominantly black characters. There was a insideriness to the way that story was told that I don't think they quite achieved with Unfinished Deep South. And unlike Laura, I really didn't care for the music and the sound elements in the show. I thought they were like a little bit too on the nose. They sounded a little bit too much like the choices you would pick for a film and not for a podcast. So those are quibbles. Overall, Unfinished Deep South, thumbs up for the project. Can't wait to listen to season 2 of Unfinished, which I guess is coming out soon. So,
I think it's actually already out.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, we'll have to check that out.
I think when some people go to look for it, they might go for Unfinished Deep South and it's unfinished. Not Whiskey Creek, but something
like that.
Creek.
Yeah.
Yes.
Everything's meshing together.
All right. Well, let's take a big turn, shall we? Now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the crime of the week. Jimmy McDonald thought he was going to drown in the middle of Lake George in New York. His kayak had flipped and he was sliding out of his ill-fitting life preserver. Sure he was a goner, Jimmy prayed to God for help. And that's when a boat full of priests showed up. They grabbed his hands and pulled him safely aboard. But what were those priests doing on Lake George? Well, they were all on a floating tiki bar.
Yeah, of course
as
they were.
Priests too. Jimmy said that after being sober for 7 years, it was kind of ironic being saved by a booze cruise. It was also ironic for the priests. Jesus told his disciples, "I will make you fishers of men." They didn't realize he meant that literally. So panel, the Lord's work interrupted the party for these priests. What was the most popular cocktail on their floating tiki bar? Laura Bricker, I'm going to start with you. What do you think?
I'll tell you what it wasn't, Rebecca. So when I worked in the newsroom, had a friend who was a church hopper, and she used to go around to different churches. And so she ended up often going to dinner with this Father Finnegan. And she was a non-drinker. And she used to order the Virgin.
And Father Finnegan wasn't.
And Father Finnegan was drinking. And my friend would say, "I'll have a Virgin Mary." And Father Finnegan turned like 5 shades of fuchsia every time she did that. So that is what they are not drinking. There are no Virgin Marys on the booze cruise.
All right. What do you think, Toby Ball? What is the most popular cocktail on these priests' floating tiki bar Lake George booze cruise?
A squalid nunnery.
Is that a drink?
I don't know. I just made it up.
Frangelico.
What do you think, Kevin Flynn?
I think it was the frozen Lazarus. You don't drink it today, but you drink it tomorrow when you need to get out of bed.
That's very good.
Thank you.
That's a deeply Catholic joke that I'm not sure I understand. You can explain it to me later. I thought it was just like Cavassier because they're so smooth, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us. Remember to follow us here on Facebook. We'll be back again next week with another true crime review. On behalf of all the crime writers, thanks so much for watching. We will catch you later.
Later.